Welcome everybody to another Rising Tide Talk. I'm Matt, Roleplay Chat Copelli, and today we're going to be talking about building accessibility into your TTRPG worlds. And I think this is a really interesting topic of conversation. I'm humbled to be joined today by an industry expert in game design and a big advocate for accessibility in gaming. He is the creative force behind Wyrmworks Publishing. Please join me in welcoming Dale Critchley to our interview today. Dale, welcome to RT Talks.
Thanks. I'm honored to be here.
Awesome. So Dale, I'm super pumped to be talking about accessibility in gaming today with you, specifically, building TTRPG worlds or settings or taverns or you name it, whatever it is that we're building it with accessibility in mind, I think is something that is really fascinating. I was looking through my show notes as I was preparing for today's interview, and I noticed that about 2 years ago, I had a discussion with Chris Hopper, one of the members of the community here, talking about kind of formatting and how to do layout and formatting in an accessible way to readers. And I think we're kind of coming full circle here, where instead of talking about the accessibility of a physical document or a physical product, this idea of baking the accessibility into the TTRPG setting is something that I think is kind of fascinating. So I'm really eager to jump into this chat with you today. I've decided to kind of categorize our conversation into three main pillars of conversation. The first being just definitions and foundational, pieces. And then I'm thinking to talk about a little bit more about just general advice for making accessible content and, making worlds and settings accessible. And then, of course, at the end, hoping to talk a little bit about tools and resources. And of course, as always, in any RT Talks, the last 15 or 20 minutes of our conversation is going to be dedicated to questions from our audience. So if folks in the audience have thoughts that, they want Dale and I to cover in today's conversation, there's a text chat thread. Post your questions there, and we'll get to those at the latter half of today's conversation. So I've been rambling on quite a little bit there. Dale, you're ready to talk about accessibility?
Yeah, let's go.
All right, awesome. Let's do it. So starting off with some of the basics, I'd love to know kind of at a high level, Dale, what do we mean exactly when we say making a world accessible?
Yeah. So, when people think about accessibility, it's usually they're thinking about like wheelchair ramps, stuff like that. Curb cuts are probably the sort of classic universal design example. And that's physical accessibility. But accessibility, like those are actually more what you might call like examples or symptoms, maybe even. But really, we like to go kind of deeper into that and talk about like social accessibility. And it's kind of the idea where whatever you're doing, whatever you're making, whatever like anything that involves people outside your sort of immediate social circle or whatever, and oftentimes even includes them, is that you're sort of considering everybody and even like expecting people to show up that aren't there yet. And kind of the idea is that you're sort of rolling out the welcome mat before people show up in a way that says, you were thinking of me when you do this.
Yeah.
I'm welcome here.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I'd be curious to know, this definition of making a world with accessibility in mind. I know that the TTRPG Rising Tide Discord community is a space with a lot of people making a lot of different things. We don't always build a world in the things that we're creating. Sometimes we're building a 13-page Zine supplement. Other times we're building a stream or a podcast. I'd love to know from your perspective, how can we stretch this definition to apply to as many things as possible? Or I mean, I suppose it already kind of does. Now that I think of it, but would you say that regardless of what it is that we're creating as a tabletop RPG creator, can we and should we be making it with accessibility in mind? And I'd love to hear your kind of thoughts on that.
Well, this is kind of the idea that when you consider accessibility, and I mean, really the tabletop space is, there's sort of the old joke that everyone's passing the same $20 bill around, but like drive-through takes their cut each time. But, you know, it's a niche audience. And so because of that, like, do you really want to exclude a portion of that? And so regardless what you're making, you want as many people as possible to be able to use it, to feel like, hey, this is for me. And yeah, I mean, like sometimes you're making, oh, well, we're making this, horror thing and not everybody's into horror, or whatever. Okay, fine. But 20% of the population are disabled in some way. All right. Do you really want to exclude potentially 20% of your potential audience, And so, right there, you're thinking about purely from a selfish perspective, do you want to leave that money on the table, so to speak?
Yeah, well, and I mean, I think even money aside, like I think people in this space tend to be very passionate about the things that we're creating. And I think making something, regardless of whether it's a setting book or a collection of 10 random tables for magic items, making it so that everybody and anybody can enjoy it, I think is an important thing that people feel passionate about. And I know that accessibility is something that you feel passionate about because you're here talking about it. So I think, yeah, there's the economics of it, but I think deep down there's also this importance of sharing the love of the game with everybody and anybody, right? And hoping that they can see themselves in it as well.
Yeah, exactly. And and the other thing is like just you make something and you want people to use it and enjoy it, and and just the idea that that there's people out there that are sitting at their tables with their friends and they're using your stuff and they're having a good time because of the work that you put in. Like that's a happy thought, and I think that's probably what motivates most of us. And so yeah, like okay, well now more people can feel like, hey, this is for me.
Awesome. One thing that kind of came to mind to me, Dale, when I was preparing myself for today's conversation was in which way was what we're going to be talking about tonight different from the conversation I had with Chris on accessibility in layout? And I'd love to hear kind of your perspective about the similarities, but then also the differences that might exist when we're looking at accessibility from a more world building perhaps, or from a more content creation perspective versus the more nitty gritty of, laying out a page or putting headings or subtitles and things on a document.
Sure. And I'll give you a couple of examples and I get these on a pretty regular basis, but when we made Limitless Heroics, we wanted to make sure that no one was excluded. And so we actually made a book that included pretty much every disability, neurodivergent, and mental and chronic illness trait in existence, with the exception of 3. And so because of that, I get notes from people like, I have spina bifida, and my experience is never represented anywhere. Not movies, not TV, nothing, unless it's like a documentary or something. But now I'm in D&D, and it was just like, I got so many notes from people that were like, I'm crying because I finally feel like someone knows I exist. Another one was, I just recently started a group here in town, just live in a fairly small town, and just said, hey, anybody that wants to come and play, we're going to meet on Thursday nights. And so we're using our Andover Access Punk setting. And I started out with a description that talks about that it's designed for the awareness that disabled and neurodivergent mentally ill people exist. And one of our players said when his first night there, and he had never played D&D before, but was eager to learn, he sees that and he goes, hey, I'm neurodivergent. Thank you. And it was just like, it just communicated immediately to him that you're welcome here. Like he just, any apprehension that he may have had, any feelings that he might need to like mask that or anything like that, like it was gone. It was just like, oh, I can be myself here. I'm welcome here, and it's like, frankly, most of the group is neurodivergent, myself included, but it was like, it just immediately created this space. I mean, like my goal for the group was to create a space where anyone who comes should feel welcome, and that will be the culture of the group. And it immediately was. Like I didn't have to sort of finesse that or encourage it or anything like that. It just was. It just happened instantly.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I'm not sure every table can say that, but I think having quite literally a supplement that helps encourage that through its content, I think might facilitate those kinds of conversations, right? For folks to feel at ease. So that's a fantastic example of kind of having, your list of the various disabilities or handicaps or whatnot listed out, as well as conditions, medical conditions, and things like that you mentioned. I think that's a really interesting way to approach it. For those of us who might not be as well versed with that kind of thing, and now I'm kind of moving into my second topic of conversation for tonight, and this is advice, general advice. I'd like to kick it off by saying, for somebody who might be looking to create a new tabletop role-playing game system or a supplement or an adventure module, any kind of writer out here listening, what kind of advice could you give them as a place to start to make their content or their world or their setting or whatnot be a more accessible place?
Sure. So this is a difference when we're talking about like game mechanics versus sort of world building. All right. So like with game mechanics, for example, like I mentioned Limitless Heroics, and that's one example of how you can do disability representation. All right. Where we broke it down, and there's there's just it's kind of all over the map of where how it's expressed. All right, but it's expressed in like die rolls and ability checks and things like that, and so there's like pluses and minuses and stuff, and but it's more than that. But not everybody's comfortable with that, and so it's worthwhile to consider, like when we figured out how are we going to implement this in Free 5e, we wanted to make sure that everyone's sort of desires and how they want to be represented are included. And so there's really three different ways. All right. So the way that it's done in Limitless Heroics is one of them. All right. Another one, probably the best example, is the combat wheelchair, where it's basically there's benefits, but not really penalties. All of any sort of what you would consider a penalty is purely narrative. And so it's in fact, in a way, it's a solution to a problem that at least mechanically doesn't exist. But for people that are just like, yeah, I don't really want to dwell on the problem, but I love my wheelchair, and so the idea of magicking that up or whatever is great, and that's great. And then other people don't want any mechanics tied to it at all, purely narrative, and that's fine too. And so it's worthwhile to consider all of those. And you think that it sounds complicated, but it's really not that complicated if you just kind of stop and think, mechanically, how would this be done? And sometimes it's just a matter of, if you're doing it this way, do this. And like the narrative stuff, kind of, you sort of mentioned at the beginning, and then the rest of it, you don't really have to worry about because it's all just being done narratively anyway. But then there's also, even with that, in Free 5e, where we had that, we still accounted for disabilities. For example, we replaced the blinded and deafened condition in 5e with nullified, so that you could have other senses that were changed. And also it got rid of the confusion of the difference between actual blindness, where you're sort of used to navigating the world that way, but don't have daredevil superpowers, as opposed to someone who all of a sudden gets a super bright light flash in their face and is not used to navigating the world without primarily their sight. We also implemented Parasense to replace blindsight, because we realized that blindsight is really poorly described and kind of leaves a lot of open questions and doesn't really make sense. We thought, we could actually have some fun with this.
Yeah.
And that's the other thing mechanically is like, how could we have fun with this? How could we change this so that we're thinking about what people's experiences are and sort of keep that in mind. But then what can we do with that would make things more interesting? Because anytime you're considering a wider range of people, you're just bringing more variety into your game, and it's just going to be more interesting anyway. So then, when it comes to world building, well, I mean, one thing to keep in mind is that what's accessible for one person may be not accessible for someone else. So, for example, I'm hard of hearing. So I generally, I need certain things amplified and other things quieter. All right. Someone else who maybe has just like loud noises, any kind of loud noises are hard for them. All right. They're not going to want certain things amplified. They're going to want everything quieter. So there's things like that where different people need different things.
Yeah. Dale, I hate to interrupt you, but I can't keep thinking to myself, like, this must have taken an incredible amount of research on your part to incorporate all of this. Do you have like an expert on the team that's quite knowledgeable and certain, like in blindness, for example, or is this something that you just, you did a lot of research and you got consultants and stuff? Like, how did you go about learning about all of these things?
Sure. No, that's a fantastic question. So first of all, with Limitless Heroics, which is how we got our start, that one, it literally, the book started with me talking to my family, where we have a lot of disabilities and neurodivergence in our family, and saying, hey, I want to make a little supplement to put up on Drive-Thru or DM's Guild or something like that. That's going to just be some like accessibility devices. And I wanted to recognize that most of them have drawbacks that go along with it. Medication has side effects, and and prostheses, one prosthetic might be helpful for one thing, but then it's like makes it worse for something else, or it's cumbersome or whatever. And then I realized that, kind of what I mentioned before, it was a solution to a non-existent problem. And I thought, oh, there's just really no sort of actual authentic disability representation in existence for like any version of D&D. Or so then we have to create that first. And because a couple of my kids have really rare neurological disorders that are like the number of people in the world that have it is counted in like the dozens, they're never included in anything, and so I'm like, I don't want them to feel left out. And I realized that really a lot of the disability experience is being left out of things. And so I went, okay, I don't want anyone left out. And so, okay, I'm going to figure out a way to include everyone. And so I figured out that by breaking things down by trait, because there's a lot of overlap. I mean, a lot of people have chronic pain for all different kinds of reasons. And so I just started to research everything I could to sort of come up with a giant list. And then while I was doing that, I also started to think about, how would you represent this? And then I started asking questions, and I put out there on like Reddit and a few other places and said, hey, this is what I'm working on. If you are disabled or neurodivergent or whatever, and are interested in sort of discussing with me how you would like your experience to be represented, then talk to me. And when it's all done, I have no idea what it's going to become or whatever at this point, but whatever it is, I will send you a free digital copy of whatever it is when it's done. And a lot of people responded to that and really appreciated it, to the point that people are just saying, you have to do this. You've got to make this happen. Yeah. and so I talked to as many people as I could. And then once I realized, hey, this is actually a viable thing, we need to do this, I started talking to other like professionals, like in the disability services, and like therapists and and advocates and things like that. And so like we ended up with 5 sensitivity readers on the project. I mean, like it was necessary because it was just so broad. And then once we had it was like after the Kickstarter was done and we had the manuscript done, then we put it out there to the backers and said, anybody, if you're represented here, please read this and give us your feedback. And we got like 90 pages of feedback from, it was like 900 people downloaded it and looked at it. And we went through every single piece of feedback. And there were ones where you'd have a trait where one person says, yes, this is exactly my experience. And someone else says, no, it's nothing like that. And our goal was, and we actually achieved this, to include every one of those, even when it seemed contradictory, and to find a way to find the intersection of those.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it did take a lot of research and just talking to a ton of people. And I mean, honestly, the secret is talking to people, with any of this. But because of the research that we did for that, that's really been the foundation for everything else we've done, because I learned so much through that, through the research, through the conversations, through subsequent conversations since then. I still have on a regular basis with people, and we use that to build on when it comes to developing other things.
Mm-hmm.
And then as we go, like for example, with all of the vision related stuff in Free 5e, when we kind of came up with this concept, there was some questions that started coming up about, okay, but how exactly is this experienced? So I reached out to the Knights of the Braille community and said, hey, here's our concept. Is this accurate? Here's some questions about like ranges and, and things like that, and how would this work? And I got feedback from them, and we incorporated that feedback. And so, I mean, there's a lot of communities out there, and sometimes it's like a group of people. There's groups where they're happy to answer those questions, and sometimes you got to pay somebody to look things over.
Yeah, I think it's kind of a balance, right?
Mm-hmm.
Do you feel, I'm trying to extrapolate, the experience you went through to create your content, which was a very exhaustive collection, really,
Mm-hmm.
a very impressive collection, a very complete collection. Like maybe I ought to ask you, Dale, do you think it would be valuable for other creators to try to distill that into smaller, more bite-sized inclusions
Yeah.
in their own content? And if so, how would you recommend they go about doing that? Because
Sure.
as fantastic as the large comprehensive list and all of the research goes, I'm debating whether or not there is space for something as complete as that in, let's say, like a 2-page RPG or a small collection of prompts or whatnot.
Right.
So anyhow, I don't exactly know my question. I hope that made some sort of sense, and I'll throw it over to you.
No, this is like 42. I think I have the answer. I'm not sure what the question is. So,
Okay, good.
what you can do, and what we did, like just for example, in our Stone Harbor supplement, we thought about how could you kind of like you said, distill that down. You've got mobility, you've got sensory, and then there's that sort of social aspect of just like whoever you are, you show up and nobody gives you the side eye because you're different. And then body shape is probably the other biggest one. If you want to kind of take those, if you can account for those, that will in one way or another cover the bulk of things. All right. Each one of those is pretty broad. All right.
Yeah. And I want to also preface my question by saying, I'm not asking because I want people to exclude others, but mainly sometimes the scope of a project might better suit a more distilled version of what we've been talking about. But anyway, yeah, back over to you.
Yeah, no, and absolutely. And it's really important.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, no one's gonna reproduce Limitless Heroics. It was this huge gargantuan thing. All right. I never imagined it was gonna get that big. And really it was only because of just the massive support that we received from it, that it became what it was. It was, but that was like the question that when we started to work on Free 5e, because when we made Limitless Heroics, the goal was we want people to start thinking about disability representation in
Hmm.
RPGs, right? And like the dream was that one day somebody will sort of take this concept and integrate it into the system, preferably into like D&D itself, so that it's like already there in the core books. And then like the 2024 books came out and they didn't do it. And I was disappointed. That's a whole nother thing. So when my youngest daughter was like 3 years old, my older kids were like in high school marching band, and they were doing this. We were at their marching band presentation, and the director conductor, he was talking, and he kept talking and talking, and my daughter's sitting there going, march, 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 and they weren't doing it, and finally we're sitting there in the bleachers. She goes, I go do it, and she just started taking off toward the field, right? That was kind of what it came down to for us is like, all right, well, if they're not going to do it, then I go do it, And so, but then we said, okay, how do we do this then? How do we take a 460 page book and distill it down into just like, essentially some sidebars, but then also just sort of integrate it into the rule system?
Yeah, 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 yeah. I mean, I like the categories seem to be like a good starting point, a place, like you were
Yeah.
saying, right? That's
Yeah, so
good fun.
like we like in Stone Harbor, okay, it's a city that's partly under the mountains and then extends onto the beach and onto a dock and extends out sort of over the ocean. And so there's a merfolk city a couple of 100 miles away, and there's a lot of commerce between them. All right, so if the merfolk are coming into the city, then they need a way to navigate around the city. All right. So the way that's been done in the past is like you've got wheelchairs. Okay, but there's probably better ways to do that. All right. Well, because in this case, it's like half of the city's under the mountain. You have mountain runoff. And so you said, okay, what if we take that runoff and we build aqueducts throughout the city? It's sort of the way you'd have bus routes. And the merfolk can get into those aqueducts because they run down into the ocean. And then they can just sort of swim upstream to get there but then be able to navigate around the city in these aqueducts. And then there's also sort of exit ramps to be able to get to the parts where there's no aqueducts.
Hmm.
And there's pools, but those pools, there's wheelchairs there. But we also thought about, okay, merfolk, like you look at pictures of merfolk, sitting position, the way that we would think of it, is not a natural position for them. If anything, their back's sort of arched. All right. So we said,
Yeah.
okay, so for them, a comfortable wheelchair would be like where they can lean forward onto something and navigate that way with their tail behind them. And, so it's thinking about who is this for
Yeah.
and what's going to be most comfortable for them. What do they see as the obstacles?
Yeah, yeah, very interesting. And I think we're in a world, in a setting, in a game where there's magic, right? There's all this magic. So sometimes the discourse online about making these magical worlds accessible to the people in them feels a little bit silly because of course we can make the worlds accessible to people, right? There's all of these. It's a fantastic magical place. So let's do what we can as the creators of the spaces that we're playing in to to make people feel comfortable and to tell interesting stories, because you can tell such interesting stories when you consider other perspectives, like you're saying, Dale. Absolutely.
Yeah.
I'm looking at the clock, and I had a couple other questions that I wanted to ask you, but I wanted to make sure that I get a chance to look at the questions that were asked to us by the TTRPG Rising Tide community. We have a couple questions. One's from Saffron Shiba Inu. They have two questions. I'll start with one, and then I'll maybe come back to them if we have time. One of the questions here is, does accessibility in TTRPGs include safety tools like the X card?
Yeah, I mean, accessibility comes down to making everyone feel welcome, right? And you never know what is going on, with your players. And so, part of that is also considering not just, a lot of times people think accessibility to think physical, but there's also mental. I also deal with a form of depression. And there's certain stuff that I've experienced that I don't really want to experience that in a fantasy. And so, being able to just say, yeah, hold on, whether it's like the X card, we use like lines and veils, and like Sly Flourish calls it's basically the X card. Pause a minute, where you just say, wait, hold on, can we rewind? Can we, whatever? And it's just respecting that different people have different experiences, and it's a game. It's supposed to be fun. So let's make it fun for everybody.
That's it. Yeah, that's the key piece. You're spending your Friday night or your Sunday afternoon or what have you playing games with friends. So you want them to be fun and safe. Definitely. ABS has a question that they asked. They say, are there any resources you recommend? Books, websites, advocates, etc. Any suggestions are appreciated.
So many and so few, especially when it comes to, when it comes to accessibility, and Chris already talked about sort of the product itself and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And VTTs there's sort of pluses and minuses to those. I've talked to some folks about doing some things in Foundry because it's so modular, but it hasn't happened yet. Sadly, the one that I thought was going to be really good was the WotC's, I'm drawing a blank, my ADHD meds ran out. The one that they just announced is going away.
This was like the virtual tabletop thing that they were pushing pretty hard a couple years ago. I forget what it's called too. I think we all know what you're saying though.
Yeah. So, but that was, talking to some folks that were involved in the testing on that. They were talking about how accessible it was. It was going to be fantastic. And I'm like, I don't really care about the 3D stuff, but man, if it's going to be more accessible to people, awesome. But then they killed it. Especially when it comes to representation, there's not a lot out there. Everybody's heard of the combat wheelchair. Adam, who's part of this group that made Those Who Wander, he incorporated some stuff, and that's some good stuff.
You talked a little bit, Dale, about just reaching out and finding some of these communities, right?
Mm-hmm.
That maybe aren't necessarily tabletop role-playing game communities, but still advocates and experts in their own right. Was that something that you just kind of like looked up individually, or was there kind of like a repository of some of these kind of organizations?
Yeah, no, it was like going on Reddit and, finding communities there. When we did Limitless Champions and I had a character with dwarfism, I went on r/dwarfism and said, hey, I'm working on this thing. If someone's willing to help me out, I'm looking at this particular form of it and, and stuff, and I'll pay you. And unfortunately, representation is just not a thing.
Yeah. Well, if something comes up or you think of something, I'm sure we can post it post interview if you'd like. And otherwise, I'll do a little plug for the TTRPG Rising Tide Discord community. Like Dale was saying, talking to people is one of the best first steps you can take. So use communities like this one as a resource to you if you're looking to ask questions or find other communities that are more focused. I think that this could be a good place. You could ask your questions here, and we can try to point you in the right direction.
Yeah, for sure.
Let's see. We have about 10 minutes left, and we have a couple last questions in here. I'll try to zoom through them lightning round. Actually, wait, yeah, two left. One from Kit. Kit asks, "What are resources for digital accessibility?" So providing accessible information and physical built accessibility or representation, like wheelchair users at the table, for instance, or folks that need high contrast, not color coding and such like that.
Yeah, so accessible games, it's accessiblegames.biz. They do these layered PDFs where you can kind of, depending what you need, you can in a certain PDF readers, you can like choose which layer you want. That's fantastic. When we made one of the principles in Free 5e is we're using black and white, more high contrast kind of artwork. Black and white artwork is much more accessible than color. I know people love color, but you don't run into color blindness issues, right? It is for people with low vision. They don't have to worry about it. Like they can, or you can, they can like blow it up and see it better. And also something that we're hoping to do eventually is in physical braille products, those black and white images can be converted to tactile images.
Oh, very cool.
So that they can actually feel what it, this is the exact shape of it. I also, over on the Knights of Braille, I heard a fantastic, like just a day or two ago, they said Legos, if you're doing like any kind of like map stuff, you can sort of trace your walls and stuff with Legos. You can do all kinds of stuff with Legos and they're completely tactile.
Yeah.
I thought that's a fantastic idea.
Yeah, and who doesn't have a bunch of Legos laying around? Right? It's an awesome.
Right? If you don't, you should.
Absolutely.
And the other thing I'll say is don't like drive through when you put your stuff up there and it gives you the option to put like the sort of copy protection on it. Don't do it. Right? The pirates can get around it and screen readers can't read it. So just it's not worth it. Don't do it.
All right, we got one last question here from Zeal Zaddy. Zeal Zaddy is asking about grants. Were you able to get grants to help cover the costs of your work?
That would have been cool. No, unfortunately. Although we did have some really generous people. We've had just a lot of support from people that said, this is really important. I got to support this. Which has been really great because when your primary audience is people that are on like disability and stuff and aren't even allowed to accumulate money, it's not real lucrative. So I really appreciate those who have been able to pitch in to help out to make the difference.
Awesome. Well, I think that brings us to kind of the end of our chat, Dale. I'm sure we could have kept going for a pretty long time.
Yep.
Talking about all of this, but that's usually the case in the TTRPG RT talks. The folks that join us are always so passionate about what they're here to talk about. So thank you for being here. This has been a very enlightening and awesome conversation. Before we say our goodbyes, I want to kind of pass the microphone back over to you for any last thoughts that you might have or considerations that you want to kind of leave this conversation and the audience with. And then, of course, after you've done that, can you please let us know where people can find you on socials, where they can purchase any of the work that you're doing and kind of plug into any upcoming projects that you might have as well?
Sure. Kind of the motivation, our thoughts behind this whole concept of accessibility is number one, when you're creating a fantasy world, you start with the real world and then you modify things. It's like the world, but it's medieval. And there's dragons and wizards and elves and what we don't think about is so often we unconsciously say, and there's no disabled people. And it's like, wait, why would you remove them? And I've talked to so many people, and myself included, before I started all this. It's like, I never even thought about it. Mm-hmm. But like once it would be like saying, okay, there's no women. Like, what? And it's like, why would you exclude an entire demographic, a huge percentage of the population? And so, we're all about, okay, stop and think, who might you be excluding? And it's not that, that you need to have like all this sort of token representation or something like that, but just sort of think about what's the real world like, and, what would it be like there? And the other thing is, like you mentioned, like it's a world full of magic. And a lot of the pushback that we get is, okay, well, why don't you just magically heal things or whatever? And you go, well, you know what? We live in a world where it's already, our science is pretty magical, and there's still not a lot of access to that. And frankly, like I think of myself, my ADHD, while I do manage it with medication, I would not want to lose it. It's a big part of who I am. And for a lot of people with whatever their disabilities are and stuff, it's part of who they are. And they don't want to be healed from it. They just want to be accepted for who they are. A lot of times we can look at a fantasy world and say, okay, well, in a fantasy world, you could do this, this, and this. Like, then stop and think, what's the real world analog? How can we do this in the real world? A lot of times we've got technology that's even better than that. And a lot of times, like aqueducts, that's not exactly fancy technology, and, even just like a chair that's shaped differently, or an environment that's designed a little bit differently, graded ramps instead of steps or something like that work for everybody and improve everybody's lives pretty much. That, like, okay, well, how can we make both our table more accessible, but also then in turn, how do we take that out into the real world?
Yeah. Some deep stuff there, Dale. Some deep stuff. I appreciate it, definitely. And if people wanted to find your content, where can they do that?
Wyrmworkspublishing.com. It's the easiest way to find us. It's worm like dragon, WYRM. Or if you have trouble spelling that or remembering that, inclusiverpg.com will take you right to Limitless Heroics, but it'll also take you to the rest of our website. Or free5e.com will take you to our free 5e stuff, which is also on our website. That's the easiest way to find our stuff. We've got a contact form there. You can email me at dale@wyrmworkspublishing.com. And if you look for on Mastodon or Blue Sky or Discord for Wyrmworks Dale, you can find me that way.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Dale, for being here to talk to us about accessibility in our TTRPG settings, worlds, and everything in between. It's been a wonderful pleasure. I hope people listening, whether they be live in the server tonight or post in, on YouTube land or podcast land, please go check out Dale's content. You'll be able to do so. There'll be links in the show notes and the descriptions of today's episode. And while you're doing that, I'd also like to encourage you to follow the TTRPG Rising Tide, wherever it is that you do your socials. That's at TTRPG Rising Tide on Blue Sky, on Threads. Go look for it wherever you're on socials, and I'm sure you'll find us there. You can stay tuned to what we've got going on. We'd also appreciate it if you could spread the good word of this amazing Discord community for TTRPG creatives by TTRPG creatives. I've been Matt at roll_play_chat on all socials, and this has been another RT Talks. You can join us live in our Discord server for our next talk. I don't know if we have a date yet, but it'll be at some time in November, and we're going to be joined by Zeal Zaddy to talk about producing your first actual play. That's going to be really fun. That'll be a neat chat. And Scott has a lot of experience. Zeal Zaddy has a lot of experience in that. So looking forward to that, and stay tuned for the next one. Dale, thank you so much for being here today.
Oh, thanks for the opportunity.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks to Jess for organizing it. And thanks to all the listeners. Remember, folks, a rising tide lifts all boats. We'll see you next time. Bye, everyone.
Bye.